Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. I'm Samia Aziz, celebrating the power of literature and the voices of authors and changemakers from the global majority. Join me as we explore the stories that inspire, connect, and transform our world. Let's uncover the stories that truly matter together. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Saima Begum, a British-Bangladeshi writer whose voice is courageous, lyrical, and intent on bringing untold histories out of the silence. Saima lives in London, and though The First Jasmines is her debut novel, she's already made her mark. She won the MFest Short Story Competition in 2021. Her novel, The First Jasmines, published by Hajar Press, is set during the final stages of the Bangladesh Liberation War in 1971 and follows two sisters, Lucky and Jamila, who are captured by Pakistani soldiers and held in a detention camp. Locked in a single room by the river, they see outside a barred window the white jasmines blooming day and night, even as the brutal violence of war wages all around. What emerges in The First Jasmines is not just a story of war and the suffering it inflicted, but a deeply human account of survival, memory, and the afterlives of violence. Saima explores how women in the detention camp develop inner lives even under extreme oppression, how they talk among themselves, remembering their lives before, reflect on motherhood, marriage, beauty, bodily autonomy, and struggle for dignity. One of the powerful thematic threads is that of silence. The way atrocities get erased, how victims' lives and stories are compressed into statistics, how language itself becomes battleground. Another important theme is what happens after the war, the challenge of returning, of resuming a life in the aftermath of unspeakable harm, the weight of secrecy, shame, and the community's pressure to forget. In Saima's own words, she felt that she didn't see that reflected in literature about Bangladesh and its war, and this gap compelled her to write. The First Jasmines confronts the way history is constructed, what is omitted, what is remembered, and by whom, and the cost of silence, especially for women. It's a novel that asks its reader to witness, to hold with care, to attend to what has been forgotten, as well as to what endures. Just a heads up, this conversation talks about sexual violence. I'm so glad Saima is my guest today. Saima, welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf. It's so wonderful to have you on the show. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me on the show. I've been a big fan of the show, actually. I think I've pretty much listened to almost everything that's available on Spotify.
Wow, thank you. That means a lot, and this was a lot of episodes as well. But thank you so much. I have read your debut novel, The First Jasmines, and I just think there's so much to unpack. And you've done such an amazing job in writing about a period of history that is not very well known or talked about. I mean, you write about it in your author notes as well, just in terms of like academia, just the lack of sources available, especially those in English and that those that we can access. And yeah, like I know that a lot of people don't know a lot about the 1971 War of Independence, I think it's called, but I'm sure it's got many different names and connotations. I wondered if you could just start by telling our listeners a little bit about why you decided to focus on that particular part of history.
Well, almost 10 years ago now, I was working on my undergraduate dissertation about the women in the Liberation War, the so called Birangona women, war heroines. And I was really struggling to complete it, actually. I had to keep asking for extensions on this. It was because I was struggling to find secondary sources and even primary sources for the kind of topic that I was working on. It affected me in a great way, actually, to realize that there's this great absence of information, this great absence of curiosity and interest in this part of history. There was, you know, footnotes in history books. There were snippets of mention in fiction, and there were insinuations of something happened. There's a great big number of women who suffered something during the war. There was a symbolic kind of mention of them as heroes or as victims or as, women who were raped. But, they were throwing around great numbers, hundreds of thousands of women, but they were absent in any great kind of detail. So not only was I intellectually demoralized by this absence, but I thought it was a kind of moral injustice for this part of the story. There's I found it fascinating, the kind of topics that historians and writers and researchers and the kind of funding that could be given to people um, for a certain topic in history, but not to others, right? And this was clearly one of those topics where it was, I guess, considered an insignificant topic to really research that deeply. So that greatly affected me for many, many years, actually, and I really struggled to complete my dissertation. And then I realized quite soon afterwards that academia itself was not the medium with which I really wanted to know these women's stories. I was reading testimonies and I was reading, a historical analysis of the intentions of the generals who were, strategizing for war and the freedom fighters who were um, training for battle. But what was lost was the real heartbeat of the story, which was the humanity of the people during the war. The women, not just as a statistic, as a number, but also as a soul. And that
Mm.
was entirely missing. And I think academia, unfortunately, has this language which it calls clarity, which really is in many ways just a sanitizing of the language of pain, a sanitizing of the language of humanity in all of its
Mm.
nuances of hope and love and loss and joy and beauty, and all of those things can still be found in war because it is a human experience that that causes war and that ends war. And so I found in fiction, which I had absolutely no experience in writing, by the way, I found in fiction still this very generous capacity to accommodate the depth of the human condition, the heights of the beauty of humanity, and the real depths of the evil that can come out of human action.
Mm.
And so I was almost compelled through this a very mysterious kind of vision that I had while I was struggling to write my academic paper. Um, just this quite vivid scene of two sisters running through a forest, and it was very short, but it was full of color and it was full of emotion, and it stayed with me for 10 years. I mean, I didn't anticipate doing anything with that vision, but it stayed with me for so long that it almost demanded uh, a voice of some kind. And so that is how the First Jasmines originated.
Mm. So when it came to actually, I guess, like putting the story together, I'm assuming you did find out about a lot of experiences and stories of women from that time. What was that process like of finding out these things? Because you've already mentioned that the sources about this particular part of that war was really, really hard to find. So yeah, I guess like what was that eventually like? How many things did you find out? What form did those stories come in? And yeah, I guess how did that move you?
A lot of the novel is based um, directly from testimonies.
Hmm.
And even though there aren't very many testimonies, there are, if you compile it all, there are maybe a few hundred, some or a bit more than that. But what's interesting about the limits of language is a lot of the documents gathered during that time are still in Bangla. They haven't been
Mm.
translated into English. And so there is that language barrier that
Mm.
to try and access this kind of information. And though I was able to access some of it because people translated things for me, my mother translated, spent a lot of time translating sources for me, which was incredible of her. Um, I I use testimony of the women as the central point of the novel and the narrative because it is what's missing most in the historical narrative of the country, and still to this day, it's missing.
Mm.
So um, I found that the shape of the novel became quite clear and naturally formed from the kind of structure of the testimonies that the women gave. So a lot of the testimonies were very similar. The women spoke a lot about their life before they were captured and taken to these rape camps, and they spoke very little of their life afterwards. And they spoke about the other women that they had met. They spoke about their hopes and dreams, their fears, and what was interesting is the testimonies that were gathered by researchers and historians. Some of them were gathered in rehabilitation centers that were developed a few weeks after the war. So from the women when they were younger, but most of the testimonies were gathered many decades after
Mm.
the women had left and the war was finished, and still the testimonies have a great similarity to them. So the shape of the novel and what I chose to focus on greatly respects um, the shape of the narrative that the women wanted to tell themselves. It's quite difficult to write on a topic like this because there's a great sense of responsibility and wanting to do the story justice.
Mhm.
And so you need to, well, as the writer, you kind of develop a kind of methodology where you respect the storytelling narrative of the women who had actually experienced the war. And so I try to stay as close to that as possible. So readers who've finished the novel know that once the women leave the room, leave the camp, the novel finishes very quickly after that. That could
Mm.
seem to some readers as quite an unsatisfying ending, but
Mm.
that is very much what the story is in reality. It is a very
Mm.
unsatisfying ending because these women just go into the world and they entirely disappear. Majority of them, hundreds of thousands, they disappear entirely, and um, we don't know anything about them. And what's
Mm.
interesting is the war was not very long ago. So a lot of these women are still alive. The girls who were captured in their early teens, in their mid-teens, they are now, elderly women. And
Mm.
there has been some effort to try and gather their stories, try and help these women, but still not a lot is done for sure.
Mm.
And a lot can be done if they were allocated the resources. And
Mm.
what's necessary is to hear their stories first because
Mm.
it works in the benefit of governments and groups and families and communities and relationships also to keep these women silent. And is my intention to center the women and to present the story of the liberation war through their narrative and their narrative only.
Mm. So have, because I have been so fascinated in the silence around the liberation war, and especially like, I'm Pakistani, and I know from like a Pakistani perspective, like there's like zero acknowledgement of what happened. Well, I can't say fully, but there's very little acknowledgement of what happened. And it's very difficult to have conversation in Pakistani circles about it. People don't know. People are very defensive. Um, and yeah, so I've always been really fascinated in just trying to understand and fully learn what happened. Um, and when I've spoken to uh, Bengali friends and people in community, I've heard it said multiple times that every Bengali family has a 1971 story, and I can imagine that that's massively true. And I think that when we think about Palestinian families, a lot of people will say every Palestinian family has a Nakba story. I think even a lot of, maybe all Indian Pakistani families have a partition story. Like these are defining parts of our histories and our lives and our identities. What's been your experience, I guess, of growing up in a Bengali family with Bengali identity about where the 1971 Liberation War fits into your understanding of who you are and how the community has come to shape itself?
Um, Growing up, I had a very vague understanding that there was a war once
Mm.
in the distant past. And now Bangladesh was separated from Pakistan, and before that, it was Pakistan who was separated from India. But it was a
Mm.
very muddled story of all three countries.
Yeah.
And um, what I found fascinating is a lot of the older members of my family who were who were born before the partition of India and Pakistan. They were Indian, then they were Pakistani, then they became Bengali officially, and no one really spoke about those partitions and those wars. And
Mm.
so there was a great silence as well in my family about this this story. I don't have direct family members who fought in the war, but I do have extended family members who were involved in the war in a way that would be considered heroic now, and some of them who were it would be considered quite morally ambiguous or even treacherous, right? So
Mm.
there's it's war, whether it's the the Bengali side or the Pakistani side is is very difficult and very nuanced.
Mm.
There are, a lot of people on the Bengali side who worked with the army to, help them go through the land, who help them, um, gather women, who created these camps for soldiers. And they have returned to the communities and the families and, been embraced again by everyone. And, you know, they still live as well. They still live among
Mm.
the women who were captured and raped. And a lot of the time, they were in the same neighborhood. They were family friends.
Mm.
So a woman who had been raped could have walked past a man who had potentially sent her into a camp. These are very difficult relationships that
Mm.
have formed in the communities that were hardest hit during the war. And while I was researching for this novel, I had a lot of interesting reactions to this. I had spoken to people who were students in Dhaka University that was first invaded by the army, hit by the army, which started the war. And some of them were very excited that I would be writing on this topic specifically about women, and then others had this very difficult, almost angry reaction to why would you bring up this topic? Because
Mm.
people do, uh, they memorialize the event in very different ways, and
Mm.
the trauma of it lingers with people in very difficult but also very interesting ways. And
Mm.
there's very importantly quite a an interesting gender division in the reaction to my novel, and this started from when I was beginning to write it, and it's continued on from now that it's published. I have a lot of women, Pakistani women, Bengali women, South Asian women, and beyond, who have been very supportive and very um, encouraging about the novel. They tell me that it's an important story, and I'm glad that they feel that way. But then I've also had very interesting reactions from men in particular who seem to focus on quite unusual parts of the novel, which I hadn't
Okay.
considered
Very
that
interesting.
important in the grand scheme of things. So yes, there's definitely, it really brings up great questions about what it means to be a woman and a valuable
Mm.
woman, purity culture, and who is a victim and who is a perpetrator, and who is a traitor, and who who should be celebrated and who should be ostracized.
Mm. And this is something we've seen in the world over, the sort of silencing or the removal of women from historical narrative, and sometimes very important historical moments that involve women. Women are just reduced to a footnote. But then there's other things where women's stories are omitted almost entirely. And if we just think about recent history, the liberation war of Bangladesh is one of them. But if we think about what's happened in Bosnia, if we think about what's happening in Sudan and in the Congo and in Palestine, the lack of a focus on women's stories is still so loud. And eh, I think there is definitely some nuance to that. I think trauma and wanting to rebuild one's life and not having the language and the space and the ability to process trauma definitely plays a part in that. But for something that happened, you know, 40, 50, 60 years ago, we would hope that the time has allowed for more of that work to happen. And unfortunately, it's still very minimal, as you've said and you've seen through your work, is being done. Um, and yeah, it just really, I think, makes me, reading the book also just made me think so much about how many women's stories from Bangladesh, but from other parts of the world that we will likely never know, but how important it it is actually to know and to understand what's happened. And yeah, and I think that's a really somber fact and reality, and something that I feel like we should be doing more to tackle. Um, but you talked a little bit about the reception that you've had of the book. But I'm interested in how you feel now that the book is out in the world and is finding its readers. How do you feel about the story that you've put out there?
I think it's a necessary story that can enter the conversation of the much wider narrative of the Liberation War. I think it was very important for a story to exist that centers the women and the women only. And I've done this in the kind of stylistic language ways as well, by not giving any of the soldiers names, by not mentioning any politicians by name in the book. The only um, real names that are present in the book are the names of the women. And in the wider context, it's important for those who want to know more about the Liberation War to read widely. This is one area that I have tried to support in the narrative of the war. But readers should read widely. They should read history books and also academic books and also fiction. I don't think my novel has done something close the conversation on the war, that you read the book and it's done now.
Mm.
But also it was necessary to have a woman's perspective of the war, and a woman's perspective where she is stripped of the identity of mother and daughter and wife, and she is individual,
Mm.
and her experiences of the deep pain, the deep violence, but also the hope and the desire to move on from this absolute tragic violence. And a lot of women did move on, and a lot of women did re-enter their homes and um, continued at some point to have healthy lives and healthy relationships with their families. And there were women who did not, and who required extra assistance which they did not receive. I found it quite interesting, this idea of silence.
Mm.
There's the imposition of silence from governments and society and families who wanted to uphold quite strange ideas of honor, which still exist. But there's also the reclamation of silence, where the women who did have the possibility of being embraced after they had told their stories chose not to. And that was for their own protection, that was for their own desires to move beyond their experiences in this very short time in their lives. And so I try to present the idea of silence as an individual choice as well for the women. Um, it's For a lot of the women, it was not really an idea of right and wrong. Being
Mm.
silent was wrong, and speaking up would be right. But I try to present that issue as something that had advantages, but also had pitfalls, and how those advantages did actually benefit some women in some ways, and was a source of tragedy for others.
Mm.
And so it's important to realize that uh, different people handle things differently.
Yeah.
Women might need many, many years of support, whether that be psychologically, socially, economically, and another may only um, desire to have one kind of support and would like to independently move through their own pace
Mhm.
in another area. But what is important is that women have access to all of these things so that they
Yeah.
can choose to make their own decision.
Mhm.
And so silence, it's it's a troubling topic and very nuanced, and those who should be given um, uh, those who should be able to hold that choice within their hands are often stripped of that choice, and that
Mm.
is the tragedy of what it
Mm.
means, what silence means in a conflict, in a war, in a story like this.
Mm, absolutely. That's so yeah, so interesting. I want to talk a little bit about the characters in the book. So the story is based on two sisters, Lucky and Jamila, and they're sisters, but we learn early on that Jamila is sort of like an adopted sister, if you like. And only towards the end of the novel, we really know her story and like where she came from and how she ended up to be in Lucky's life, and living as her sister. It's a really like a really beautiful exploration of sisterhood, which I really liked reading. The relationship between sisters, but obviously, like we understand from the beginning that there's some different dynamics here, because they're not biological sisters, and Jamila came into their lives several years after she was born, and bringing her own experiences and trauma and suffering essentially into that. Um, and they end up they're traveling, and they're hoping to go and see their mother who's really ill, and they end up caught by the forces and sent to one of these rape camps. And then there they meet other women. Now, where did I guess you mentioned this scene that came up in your head while you were studying, and it stayed with you for 10 years of these two sisters running. But when it comes to the actual character development of these two sisters, what really inspired that, and where did that come from?
Um, I'd say there was a moment while I was reading through these testimonies that so many of the women had mentioned the other women that they had stayed in these rooms, these camps with. And none of that was mentioned in the kind of academic writing. And I
Mm,
found that very, very interesting.
yeah.
There was a, in my opinion, a deliberate desire to strip away the relationships that people had with each other
Mm,
when presenting the story of the war and presenting the story of these women. And what's fascinating is that a lot of these women were really just picked up from everywhere in society, from, you know, uh, wealthy towns to very poor villages to, just pathways that the army was traveling through. And so you had a great variety of lifestyles
mhm,
and, the socioeconomic background of women. And some women had jobs and some women did not have jobs. And, the education levels were different. And the the opinions and mindsets of these women were very different. But these women, a lot of them, stayed together for months. There were women who were captured during the beginning of the war and were only released at the end. So they were there for 9 months, and these women did form relationships, did form friendships. There was a kind of sisterhood that formed, but that was entirely missing from any accounts that I could find,
mm,
in especially in the academic setting, and also in fiction. It didn't seem to uh, present itself in a kind of significant scene or as a kind of part of the plot. And so I had read a testimony of sisters and friends who were captured together, and I thought this would be one of the greatest ways to present the very different effects that this kind of experience can have on two women who grew up mostly in the same household under the same circumstances, who experienced essentially the same tragic event, but their lives go in very different courses at the end of the
mm,
novel. And what is also important is what I wanted to really focus on, the kind of beautiful relationships that women can have as sisters, as friends, and how easily women can form friendships, even
Mm.
quite randomly, really. And so most of the central part of the novel is the women having conversation, and not necessarily conversation about their circumstances in the room, but about their dreams of getting married and having children, or
Mm.
continuing their education. And the older women were giving advice to the younger women. The younger women were presenting new ideas to the older women. That kind of beautiful conversation and exchange is always present during war, during a conflict. There'll be a mother who saves another child along with her own child, or a mother who's lost a child and adopts a child and looks after that child during the war. A woman who has very little food to eat herself, but will share it with someone that she's just met. These kinds of very beautiful human experiences and possibilities that exist even in the most dire of circumstances, and between women, and the kind of generosity and selflessness that still exists. That was very, very important for me to present, not just between sisters, which is perhaps the most organic way that um, these kinds of human characteristics can present themselves, but also between women of all classes and faiths and ages and lifestyles.
Mm.
And so I very intentionally picked very different women who may never have encountered each other had it not been for meeting in that room. And they
Mm.
learned some very difficult and very ugly truths from each other, which perhaps they may not have accepted had they not been in the situation. And
Mm.
they they learn from each other and learn to accept each other and see each other as individuals rather than how society has labeled them and in many ways pitted them against each other by idolizing this very s- solid, very stern idea of what it means to be the ideal woman, the ideal wife, the ideal daughter, the ideal mother, and stripped of all those parts of identity and left with themselves, which they may not have had the space and the time to encounter for many years. The women are able to think about who they are
Mm.
and who they want to be after they escape.
Mm. I think the the scenes with the conversations between the women were probably my favorite parts of the book, because there was almost this, you got to a point where there was this desire for women to share their story. They wanted other people to know who they were, especially in the face of death. Um, like there was this I don't want to give away too much with the novel, but we meet this one character who ultimately doesn't make it, and she's so she's so desperate. She's like, people are going to say that I'm a traitor and I'm this and I'm that, but I want at least one person to know who I am and what I try to do. And I thought that was so powerful, because in situations of war and the unimaginable situations that these women found themselves in, um, people are forced to do things, at least outwardly, that look so different to what they would do under normal circumstances. And I guess just to have that space to be able to say, this is why I did that. I want you to actually know who I am and not judge me for this thing that I was forced to do in these circumstances. And I thought that was incredibly powerful. You write the whole book with such a poetic tenderness, and you mentioned at the beginning that what you found missing from academia essentially was the heart, the beating heart of the people and of the stories and of the narrative. And you definitely bring that beating heart into your novel from the very beginning, from the first pages. Everything is so moving and so powerful. And you give so much space for people to reflect on not just what's happening to them, but what's happening on a larger picture, even in terms of how they relate to essentially their oppressors, and how they talk about them, and still with a reference and relation to faith and prayer and forgiveness also, which I found so deeply moving. How but and also you're writing scenes and circumstances and situations that are just beyond imagination in terms of how terrible they are. And you write still with so much dignity. So many things happen off the page, and we know what's happened without you telling us what's happened. And I think that sort of that preservation of dignity is really important in literature. And I think when we understand from what you're telling us what's happened, we don't need to know some of the intricacies that you're protecting us from. But I guess for you, like, what was that process like of balancing the need of wanting to tell us something or make it known that something has happened, or the way that certain circumstances are, but also, I guess, preserving dignity and yeah, like, how did you get that balance right?
My greatest concern from the very beginning of this novel has always been to tell the story of these women in the most respectful and loving way that I could. And I it probably took me about 4-ish years to write this novel. And I didn't write every day. I wrote maybe every day for a few weeks, and then I take months away from what I was writing so I could really think about what it was that I was intending to do and the vision that I had, and if I was staying true to my intention, and um, making sure that I wasn't being, you know, influenced from research that was perhaps biased or research that
Mm,
didn't miss out things. And if I was being my most compassionate self with each woman's story,
mm,
which can be very difficult to understand because a lot of the women made very difficult choices, very unusual choices, choices that under any other circumstance it would not be understandable.
mhm,
And so to kind of um, gather myself intellectually and emotionally and morally also to get to the place where I could hold each of those stories with equal amounts of honest intention to speak the truth which I had gathered along the way and present it in um, its most respectful way, and also staying true to the storytelling style in the
mm,
testimonies that I was reading. It took many years for me to understand the kind of balance that I was trying to get to. And what's interesting was I started writing this story when I was 26. And I realized very quickly that I was very young and very naive in my thinking to be really holding a story of this kind of importance and this kind of weight. So I think what was most beautiful for me as the author was also growing in the direction of internally the story that I was trying to tell, what it required of me intellectually to get to the stage where uh, if this novel were ever translated and a woman who did experience this had ever read it, or maybe her descendants, her family have ever read it, that they would um, think that this was an almost a love letter to their experience. That was my desire uh, as the author, and it. I hope that I've done this in some capacity. I mean, even reading it now, as I've read it quite recently, um, there are a million things that I probably could have changed and may still want to change. And I'm sure as I read it again, maybe in 10 years' time, that I'll be like, oh, really should have included this as well. But what is most important is I try to show the variety of experiences of many women, and it's presented with equal amounts of importance.
Yeah.
And that is what is essential in the stories of any kind of testimony narrative of the war. There are people who do really terrible things to survive, and people who do really heroic things to survive. And it's important that a space is presented where both people can be the most honest selves, and from only that kind of honest dialogue are we able to perhaps learn as people and try not to make the same kind of mistakes again. And the very interesting thing about the silence of well, I tried not to have any graphic details about the actual act of rape. And that was so important to me, not to turn that kind of violence into a spectacle of voyeurism for the reader.
Yeah.
Because uh, to understand the degree of violence, you don't need to, spell it out. That part is not the important part here, and none of the women described in any great detail the actual act of rape. What they described was the after effects of that, the anticipation of that, how they wanted to move on from that, how they try to support themselves and others to overcome that experience. And it's the thing is, I did not want to give violence such great importance in the novel, because it's not the most important impact, and it's not the defining it's not the defining, and it's not the shaping uh it's not the kind, it doesn't shape the soul in the kind of way that a perpetrator, that a soldier, that a general, and that a country who wants to impose its will on another country wishes that it will. And it's also not interesting. violence, evil. I read testimonies from Rwanda. I read testimonies from Bosnia, from women who had been raped across the world in many wars, and the across the board, most of the women did not describe the act.
Mm.
And if they didn't want to describe it, I certainly wasn't going to describe it.
Yeah.
The reader doesn't need to know it. And
Mm.
in my in my opinion, that was a way for me to respect the experience while also presenting it in its most honest fashion.
Mm. Yeah, that's so that's so interesting because I guess it just speaks to the complexity about acts of violence. Like it's not, although of course the act of violence itself is horrific, but that's not where the horrificness stops and starts. As you describe in the book, the women, how they feel, they know it's coming even when they first enter the camp. They know what's going to happen, but then obviously the longer they're there, they know that it's coming on a frequent basis, um, and that anticipation before, and then how they feel physically and emotionally afterwards, but then also the complexity around knowing how that may or may not change them as people moving forwards, and what they want to do about that, and how that intertwines with how other people will know what's happened and how they can then show up in their families. Like there's so many layers of complexity around it, um, and yeah, I think that's not what people in aggressors in war think about. I think all they think about is the act of violence in and of itself, and think that that is going to achieve some great aim, but it never will. It That's not a sol- solution, or not a thing that's ever going to achieve anything that they think. And one of the things that comes out from your book is they talk about purity. Now you're pure. Now you're. It's just disgusting, but like, yeah, it's never ever gonna do that. Um, and you've said that the book ends fairly quickly after the women leave the camp, and yeah, it's very. I mean, that part of the book is very short, and I think just I wanted to know a little bit more about what came for all of them. I think because we followed these characters for the last however many pages and became invested in their stories, and also carried their hopes and their dreams with them. Um, and it is hard to read, I think, those pages, because some of them, for some women, they were sort of accepted back into their families and their communities, and were able to process their trauma in a way that allowed them to rebuild their lives fairly easily. But obviously, we can't capture the nuance of that fully in any novel. And then there's some women that were not, that were just completely rejected. And then there were women that mentally could not escape the horrors of what had happened, and that lived with them and changed the course of their life in ways that are incredibly uh, devastating. Um, I guess what were some of the key things that came up for you in your research, and what did you want us to really think about and understand when it came to thinking about what happened after?
Mm. Um, the ending of the novel uh, was something that troubled me from the very beginning.
Mm,
I kind of wrote the story backwards in a
mm,
sense. Um, uh, the last line of the novel I essentially wrote first, but before that, it took me years to decide where, when, and how the novel was going to end, because after the women escape these camps, and with the very few testimonies that we have of these women, they really do just disappear into the community, and we don't know very much about them. And I wanted to really honor the voices of the women, and so I chose to center the novel within a specific time frame
Mm.
of just before the women are captured to just after they're released, because I wanted to preserve a kind of honesty about their stories. And by preserving this honesty, the it the honest truth is we don't know very much about what happened to these women afterwards.
Mm.
Even the testimonies that were gathered decades later, a lot of the interviewers didn't quite ask about their lives afterwards in the kind of ways that would um, be a significant amount of research to continue the story with.
Mm.
And also there's a because these are testimonies gathered, and there is a moral standard by which academics and historians and people who wish to write about this kind of conflict have to adhere to, because
Mm.
um, you know survivors and people who were present during the war should not be pressed beyond the limits of what they would like to talk about.
Yeah.
And so if they if the women don't want to talk about in great detail
Mm.
the the after effects of the war on their lives, and the women who do, and whose testimonies were gathered were maybe steered by the academic for research purposes, there is a lot lost, and there
Mm.
is a great gap between what a writer can understand about a survivor's life and uh, and what, as a result, the reader will be able to read about.
Yeah.
And so I think this, how short the ending was after they had left the camp, I think it's, and that feeling that readers may get, whatever that feeling is after they close the book, I think it's important to have, because it is an uncomfortable feeling. It is an unfinished feeling. There are questions that remain after the women leave, about the women, long after they've escaped from the room. And I find it important to keep those questions in mind
Yeah.
uh, long after the novel is read and finished and closed and tucked away somewhere on a bookshelf.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just as you were talking, I think sometimes when you have like a I don't want to say like a satisfying ending, but when you sort of have a lot of your questions answered, and I guess with something like this, it almost feels like you're not then inclined or inspired to continue digging more or continue learning more. Um, and as much as you said earlier that like you this book isn't a way for people to pick it up and feel like, right now I know everything about the liberation war. I don't need to do anything else. I don't need to read anything else. Um, in the same way, a reminder that although this is an effort and a contribution to talking about women's stories with regards to what happened in the camps, there's still so much that we need to do, I guess, to understand what happened afterwards, because we still don't have that information. And I think that's a call to action, without actually calling it, which I hope gets taken up as well. So thank you for that. And just as my last question, really. Um, the book is obviously the characters in the book are from all different types of backgrounds, and also we've got people of different faiths. And you talked about what that explains is how sort of indiscriminate the approach was, just to round up women from all walks of life and all faiths and backgrounds. But there is still so much faith and so much Muslim faith in this book as well. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about why that was important to you to still center faith while telling the story.
I think a lot of the story is shrouded by um, interpretations of faith. So the silence that we've been talking about quite a lot.
Mm,
Some of that comes from this very distorted idea of purity,
mm,
which is a misunderstanding of faith, many faiths,
yeah.
and is imposed upon the women again and again as
Mm,
you know you are not adhering to your faith
mm,
if you speak about this. And a lot of the soldiers do speak in quite uh, religiously charged terms.
mhm,
The ideologies, the idea of a unified Pakistan, which is east and west, which is a Muslim land,
mhm,
and we must maintain a Muslim land, and therefore the East Pakistanis need to change their language, change their customs, change their palate, change their the cultural differences that are um, present in that side of Asia compared to the western side
mhm,
um, of the subcontinent. So all of these things had a quite clear um, um, religious current running through this, a religious argument coming from many different sides. So you had the government side, the religious leader side, the soldiers. A lot of them thought that they were, fighting for what was right. They were trying to maintain a unified Muslim land, and they were trying to, um, kind of reform the Bengalis who had lost their way and adopted too many Hindu customs and were too influenced by their Hindu neighbors and their Indian neighbors. And so it was very important for me to present faith in all of its nuance, to show that the absolute devastation that
mm,
can be a result of misunderstood and um, kind of patriarchal interpretations of faith, whether that is Islam or Hinduism
mhm,
or any other faith, and also to uh, show how faith can be uh, a guiding light and a source of survival for women who do believe in God
mm,
and have faith and are questioning, you know, the 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 divine kind of rulings and the kind of circumstances that they're in, and women who are not educated in faith and women who do know a little bit more
mm,
are all discussing what is right and what is wrong in such a a difficult event, circumstance. And for a lot of women in a community that puts faith in such a high position, that is their source of source of renewal, their source of healing. their understanding of themselves and what has happened and how to move on. And it was very important to put that in its rightful place in the center of the story. What I find quite interesting and what I'm entirely grateful for is my publisher who understood how important faith was central to the novel. I can imagine other publishers perhaps, suggesting that there's too much of this talk here, and it may make make some readers feel excluded, or may make some readers feel uncomfortable with how much faith is central and how much faith is spoken about here. And I suppose from a commercial point of view, that may be a kind of a restrictive thing for writing fiction. But to be honest about the story and to be true to the testimonies and the research that I have read, faith was a central part of the narrative of how the women understood everything about what happened during the war, before and afterwards. And it was absolutely necessary to give it its great place.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that, Saima. And also thank you for your time today. It's been such a pleasure and an honor speaking to you on the show. And I can't wait for more people to pick up The First Jasmines, which is out and available, published by Hajar Press. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a beautiful conversation.
I hope you loved listening to this episode and found things that will stay with you. I'd love to hear from you, so please do reach out on social media and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review, as it can really help.